progressives who aren't economists. The reason why they hate what we're saying is because they love taxing the rich. And so if we say, we don't need taxes to provide jobs for all program. We don't need taxes to provide Medicare for all. Government can pay for it. But I want to tax the rich. Yeah, tax the rich. And don't stop with a 3% wealth tax like Elizabeth Warren wanted. Take it all. 120% tax rate. Send them the bill for the other 20%. Take all of it. We all support that.
Please like, share, and subscribe.
Rise, you workers, from your slumber. All you wage slaves, everyone.
The revolution comes like thunder, and the age of hypocrisy is done.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Class Unity event. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also consider joining Class Unity and making a donation today. And make sure to let us know what you think in the comments. Today, we'll be discussing the topic of economics, heterodox economics, and money. And we're very happy to be joined by Professor L. Randall Wray, who's Professor of Economics at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College and Emeritus Professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's one of the principal economists of modern money theory. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor, and welcome back.
Okay, thanks.
We're especially happy to talk to you today because this discussion is a preparation for an up-and-coming course that Class Unity is holding. We're calling it Approaches to Macroeconomics, and we'll be studying the 2019 macroeconomics textbook, which you've written with Bill Mitchell and Martin Watts. The way we discovered this book was from all the attention MMT was getting, positive and negative, from both the left and the right, and from Michael Hudson, who's also been a frequent guest. In fact, we've already held a study group on this book and read it in 2021, so we're very happy to be reading it again with a new group. To everyone watching this at home, you're welcome to join us. This course will be meeting virtually, and it starts on Sunday, March 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern. To sign up and join, go to our website, classunity.org, and you'll find it under education. So our first question is just a big picture question about the background and the motivation for your book. So you've written a really great, incredible book on economics here. It's accessible to people with no background as an introductory textbook, but it's also written in a way that is interesting and has plenty to think about for people with a background in economic thought. And it's focused on understanding the economy in the real world. So we're wondering if we could hear some of your just big picture reflections. What are some of the difficulties that one faces when trying to learn economics today? What are some of the difficulties that one faces trying to teach people about economics today? Are any of those difficulties that you tried to address in your book? And what motivated you ultimately to write this book?
Yes. Well, I think if I remember right, Bill and I started this in 2007, I'm pretty sure. And our goal was to write a macro textbook that was applicable to the real world rather than a fantasy world, which is where virtually all other macroeconomics books are aimed. And so the first thing we decided we needed to do was to put the government front and center. Because in all the capitalist economies, the government is by far the biggest entity, far bigger than any firm. 25% to 50% of the economy is the government. And of course, it has laws and regulations and all of that. And the funny thing is, all the other macro textbooks maybe put the government in chapter 7. So you present the way the world works with no mention of the government whatsoever until about chapter 7. So we actually started off calling it Macroeconomics, a Government-Centered Approach. I think that was our original title. And then this is reasonably early in MMT. I mean, there was a following, but it was getting bigger and bigger because of the global financial crisis. And then I think we were going to have an MMT approach in there somewhere. And then finally we decided, what we did was we wrote a textbook on macroeconomics. So we should just call it macroeconomics. Our book is macroeconomics. Virtually none of the others are. Now, there are some heterodox textbooks that are sort of in the line of ours. But all of the ones that are commonly used have nothing to do with macroeconomics. Okay. You won't learn anything about the way the economy actually works by reading those textbooks. So we decided, no, macroeconomics is the right title because for the first time, there's a book here that actually is doing that. So government front and center. And we also, you mentioned it, real world macroeconomics. So it has to be applicable to the world we actually live in. And the world we live in almost all countries and increasingly spreading around the world, it's capitalist. That's the world we live in. And so our macroeconomics is not a general theory of economics. My professor, Hyman Minsky, used to always say, any general theory has to be wrong most of the time. The theory has to be specific. So ours is specific to a capitalist economy of basically the major developed countries in the world. That's the kind of economy that we're studying. And it's not necessarily because we think these are good economies, but we're trying to accurately describe the way that these things work. And I think the third thing is that we take an interdisciplinary approach. So the history of thought helps a lot, I think. See where we came from and where we have ended up. And the all of the other social sciences can help us understand the world. Anthropology helps us to understand where money may have come from and what makes capitalism a very different kind of system than the systems that existed in the past that might have used money, but money was not fundamental to the operation of the economy. And so we want to include that. We need to include some history, know where we came from, sort of. We sort of know where we came from. We cannot know where we're going. That's the nature of evolution. So we have to be aware of these other fields of study. Okay, and then finally, and you have questions later on, so I won't go deeply into this. Yeah, we have to start with macroeconomics. Okay, we're not going to do what the mainstream does. The typical mainstream economist sits in their office at their desk and imagines what an economy would be like that is made up by individuals who maximize utility and have perfect foresight. Okay. That's how they do macroeconomics. That's where they start, with an individual. Okay. We're not starting with an individual. We're starting with the economy as a whole. And we can get into why we believe you have to do that later. So that's a big difference from the way that it's done. Okay, and then the final point, the difficulties that you face trying to teach people economics. Okay. Well, my oldest daughter is somewhere around 30 years old now. I remember when she went to first grade, she came home and she told me the barter story of money's origins. And so, I listened and then I tried to gently I tell her, this isn't true. This is not where money came from. She said, yes, it is, Daddy. My teacher told us. And David Graeber, who wrote the fantastic book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, I think did his dissertation on Madagascar. And he said that he heard the barter story in Madagascar from the people there. This story is so widespread. It's indoctrination. It is everywhere. It's where everyone starts. Okay, you have to overcome that. It's extremely difficult. Everyone on earth has learned this story. Everyone on earth, well, no, let me back up. Everyone in America, because we're a particularly good example of this, is brought up believing that humans are naturally selfish. They only care about themselves. Okay. And in the neoclassical approach, they are utility maximizers. Okay. And rational. This is another huge barrier that we have to overcome. Especially if any student has actually had an economics course, and increasingly that's true. My daughter got some in first grade, but typically in high school now, the students do have an economics course, and they are taught this. And studies have proven that students who have studied economics, and it's mainstream economics, because that's what you're going to get almost everywhere, become selfish. Studying economics makes you selfish. It produces the kind of people that it purports are natural, but they're not natural. They're created by economists. Okay. And so you're faced with students who have had a little bit of economics, probably in high school, maybe even earlier, and you get them in your principles class. Okay. They've already learned these things: barter story of money, medium of exchange story of money, and selfishness. Okay. You have to overcome all of that. It's very hard.
Your book definitely presents a particular view of economics, a very complete view of macroeconomics. But one thing we love about it is it covers the range of major frameworks and theories about macroeconomics, including the orthodox neoclassical view, because we have to be aware of it and how, um, where it goes right, where it goes wrong, and how it compares to the heterodox views. So I'd like to cover these basic frameworks, um, just starting with the definitions and get your thoughts on them. So first, I'm going to read the orthodox neoclassical definition of economics, which everybody has learned about in school.
Yeah.
Quote, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants. And I'm just going to repeat that because it's important. Economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants. Professor, what does it mean to study economics defined in this way? What value or use does it have for somebody trying to understand economic phenomena, and what forces, either intellectual or political, have made it so that this definition of economics is the most popular and dominant one today?
Yeah, so it sets it all up, and usually in the typical textbook, the introductory chapter one doesn't really tell you much. We're going to do this and this. Chapter two. What's the title of chapter two in every mainstream textbook? The economic problem. Okay, what's the problem? Resources are scarce. Wants are unlimited. You cannot get what you want. Okay. Scarcity um, and versus unlimited. Okay. And then the third important word is the first in the definition: allocation. Economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources, okay, among unlimited competing wants. So it's about allocating them. There's nothing here about creating them. It's allocating them. They exist, but they're scarce. What does the market do? The market allocates these scarce resources among unlimited wants. Okay? Some people will get more, some people will get less. All right? And then we'll explain, why do some get more and why do some get less? But some are going to have to go without. And the resources are scarce. Okay. And so I would ask my students, okay, what's wrong with this definition? What's the most important resource there is in any economy, including capitalism? And, once in a while, I'll get the right answer and say, human labor. It's the most important resource there is. Okay. Is it scarce? When you think about it, and sometimes someone will say, well, there always seem to be some unemployed people out there, you know. Um, no, labor is not a scarce resource. Okay. There's so much of it: unemployed, underemployed, misemployed. Um, we could easily produce more with the labor that we have. Okay. It's the most important resource there is. Okay. Scarce. Are resources scarce? Well, not really. We make the resources. Resources don't exist. We make them. And so some people say, well, oil. Okay, well, we've had a series of energy crises, and we've always overcome them. The first one was the whale oil. Kill all the whales, and suddenly we have no oil. Okay, then you find it in the ground. You find it everywhere. We're swimming in oil. We've got enough oil to completely bake the planet so that no life form will survive. It's not scarce. Okay. And we could find and have found better alternatives already, right? We have much better alternatives than oil. So resources aren't scarce, they're created by human effort and thought, okay, and innovations and science. So it's blatantly false, is the point. Why would they tell us this story? Okay. And then that would get us into um, the particular way they explain how the resources get allocated. Okay. They're completely ignoring that we create them and we can create more if we want to. Okay. But let's stick to the resources are scarce, we got to allocate them. How do we allocate them? Well, they use marginal productivity theory. You get what you deserve. Okay. Everyone gets rewarded according to their contribution to the production process. People who contribute more will get more. Now, the most rigorous models actually don't have any production in them. The most rigorous orthodox neoclassical models have no production. We all come to the market with some resources. We have a resource endowment. How do we get it? Who knows? Don't try to explain it. But we all come to the market. You've got bananas and he's got coconuts. How'd you get them? We don't know. But you come to the market and you trade them. And the amount that you'll be able to trade with is given. You have a given resource endowment, and then you trade and get the best deals you possibly can, and then you walk away. Okay. In the less rigorous ones, because that one is so nonsensical, it's hard to sell it. So, okay, let's allow for production. Okay, so you have some production process, and we have various factors of production. We have labor as a factor of production. Okay, we have capital as a factor of production, and we have land as a factor of production. And some of you might have labor, some of you might have land, some of you might have capital. Again, we can't explain how you got it, but you've got that. And you can contribute to the production process. Your reward will be based on your contribution to production. If you contribute a lot to production, then your reward is much bigger. So now we can explain the allocation. Okay, you get what you deserve. How much did you contribute to the production process? That determines how much reward you get. All right. And so it's fair. The allocation is a fair allocation. Are you poor, homeless, starving? Your fault. It's your fault. Okay. Um, it's a justification for the distribution of output. There's no one to blame but yourself. Yeah. Um, and how what's the procedure of a neoclassical economist to develop economic theory? Well, do you go out and observe the real world, okay, and try to see how it operates and figure out uh, how capitalism works? No, that's not how you do it. You sit at your desk and you put forward a proposition. Well, humans are rational and they will take all the information available and they will maximize their own utility and they don't care about anybody else. They get no dissatisfaction from seeing someone else suffer. Doesn't bother them at all. Doesn't impact them. They also get no joy from someone else doing well. Okay, they're completely isolated individuals, unaffected by what happens to anyone else. They only care about their own individual utility. Okay, so we propose that, and then we imagine the way an economy comprised of people like this would operate. And that gives us neoclassical theory. It's not that they've gone out and studied how people actually behave. You know, they could fairly easily have asked, you know, a psychologist or maybe an anthropologist who studies different kinds of societies, you know, how do humans function? And they might have found out, you know, actually, humans are social animals. They're the most social of all animals there are. They're, you know, you can find a few individuals who behave somewhat close to the neoclassical model, but all of us would say there's something wrong with them. They're antisocial, right? Those are that's not what humans are like. Okay. So it's from the very beginning, it's obvious that this has nothing to do with the real world. They're sitting at a desk imagining something. Okay. It's bizarre. It's truly bizarre. Okay, why would they do it? Because they don't want to talk about society. They don't want to talk about the real world and how it functions and how it leaves some people behind and turns others into trillionaires. Okay, anyway, that's long enough.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't want to get sidetracked either, but there's a commented question in the chat that I think is relevant, so I'll read it out. So
Okay.
justification is substituted for explanation. So is there any explanation in the normal sense of the word at all, i.e., explanation of causes in neoclassical theory?
I think there is okay in science, you know, that's sort of the aim to see what causes this. In uh, but you're actually studying real world phenomena. Um, Neoclassical theory, with the way that they set it out, you know, the textbook exposition, uh, it's complete fantasy. Okay, so there's no attempt to connect to the real world. Robert Lucas got the Nobel Prize. I don't remember when, a couple decades ago. And he's famous for rational expectations. He made mainstream neoclassical economics, in a sense, even more neoclassical. Uh, Rational expectations basically uh, says not only are people rational, they try to maximize their utility, uh, and they have to, uh, you know, predict the future. They have to, because they're behaving in a way, and they need to know what's going to happen in the future. And he says, so they form expectations about the future, and their expectations are correct with a random error. Okay. So they are godlike in the sense that they know what's going to unfold tomorrow and on into the future with a random error term. Okay. Well, he was asked, uh, you know, why were people standing in bread lines during the Great Depression? Were they maximizing utility? Was that really the best thing they could do, is stand in a bread line rather than getting a job and earning and uh, having a better life? He said, yeah, they were maximizing utility. They had decided that the real wage they could get from working was too low for them to give up their leisure time. And so they stood in bread lines instead. Okay, they were maximizing utility. And I'm sure the reporter looked at him like he must be insane. And so he said, look, I didn't say they're happy standing in the bread line. Okay, they're not necessarily happy doing this, but given the real wage that they could get, given their marginal productivity of their labor, it was the best they could do. Well, I mean, that's explaining this. Why were people
Right,
in bread lines?
right,
Well, because the real wage, because they were so unproductive, was so low that it was better to stand in the bread line than go get a job. So that's the way they do causation. It's a thought process. It's not trying to, go interview people. Why are you standing in a bread line rather than working? And they might tell you, well, there aren't any jobs, you know. So that's the kind of causation.
right, right. So let's talk about the heterodox definition of economics. So the heterodox schools of thought are a number of different schools, including the Keynesian, the Marxist, the institutionalist. And your textbook offers a definition of economics that they all share, which I'll read out. Economics is the study of social recreation and social distribution of society's resources. And I'll read this again, just for emphasis. Quote, economics is the study of social recreation and social distribution of society's resources. End quote. So, Professor, what does it mean to study economics in this way? What value does this definition have over the orthodox neoclassical one?
Okay, so you notice that the word social is there twice. So it's emphasizing social and also creation. So it's social creation of resources. Resources are not scarce and they're not given. We create them. Okay. So humans create all the resources. I mean, of course, there are trees that are growing. That's not a resource. Okay. We chop it down, we turn it into lumber. Who did that? Labor. Okay. We created lumber out of a natural resource. Um, and social. Individuals don't create anything. Okay. There's no such thing as an individual creating something. They're always socially created. Uh, at a bare minimum, they've got the knowledge that's been passed down through many millions of years of human experience. That knowledge is passed down. Um, and usually they're also using uh, all sorts of tools and complicated equipment and so on that obviously is socially created in factories with workers together. You think about the iPhone. Uh, you know how many people in how many countries have all contributed something to the iPhone you got in your hand. Okay, there are thousands of people spread out all over the world doing little tiny parts of the iPhone, and then we've also got all of uh, the apps and everything that make the iPhone useful. It's socially created. Um, you remember the Tom Hanks movie? He's marooned on an island, and he figures out how to survive at a very, very low level of life. Um, and it seems like, well, isn't he creating some resources to survive? Well, of course, he had knowledge of fire already. Okay, and he had some basic idea of how he could try to start a fire. Um, so he had the knowledge, but also this shows something about the neoclassical marginal productivity theory, because remember in the beginning of the movie, he's this very well paid, some kind of management, working for delivery service, um, high salary. He's very productive in that society, and now he's cast away on an island, and he can barely produce enough to survive, and he goes insane doing it. So that tells you the context. His high productivity was because of the society that he lived in, right? And now he's on an island. He's not taken out of that society, and he can't survive nearly as well as someone who had grown up on an island would be able to survive. So clearly, the um, the social relations make a big difference. Okay, so it's social creation and it's social distribution. It's not according to marginal products. Think about the iPhone. How could you possibly calculate a marginal productivity for every worker who contributed something to the iPhone? Cannot be done. Okay. Now, I know that um, Amazon is trying to extremely carefully watch employees so they can try to get really close to the neoclassical ideal of paying them according to their contribution to the production process. Okay. But it's extremely difficult to do. Um, and so the that is not what determines the distribution of output. It is not marginal productivity. It's impossible usually to calculate what the marginal productivity of an individual is. So we cannot allocate the rewards that way. And more generally, um, the problem with orthodoxy is that they're not uh, trying to study the real world while all the heterodox traditions are trying to study, explain, look at causation. What causes poverty? Okay, what causes unemployment? That's what they're trying to study.
One question about macroeconomics, microeconomics. We've typically heard the subject of economics being divided in this way. So your book is about macroeconomics, and you talk about thinking in a macroeconomic way. What makes of you distinctively macroeconomic, and how does it differ from, a microeconomic view of things?
Okay, yep. So um, rigorous neoclassical theory uh, starts with the individual, and then they aggregate up. Okay, and they've had some deviations from this, and they've had debates within orthodoxy itself. Okay, so if we go back to the 1920s, um, neoclassical economics had this utility maximization, it had marginal productivity theory, all the things that I've been explaining. And uh, it really could not explain the Great Depression. It couldn't explain why um, unemployment is rising. Pagoo, who was one of the best known economists of the time and made extremely important contributions to uh, neoclassical theory, wrote a book saying the problem is the wage is too high. If we lowered the wage, firms would hire more workers and we would solve the unemployment problem. Okay, so that was the answer to the unemployment problem. Well, the wages were falling and unemployment was going up. Okay, in the Depression. And so Keynes comes up with an alternative explanation. Okay, I won't go through it now, but theory of effective demand. And it appeared that he could explain that. And so orthodoxy was in a crisis because they didn't have an answer to it except reduce wages, but falling wages was increasing unemployment. And so they sort of compromised and produced a version of Keynes that they were willing to accept, uh, where effective demand could play a role. Their compromise was, look, our story about the markets working and always generating full employment and distribution according to your contribution works in the long run. But in the short run, you could have a shock to your economy, something happens, and you end up with some unemployment. And then Keynes's story provides a guide to how we get out of the Depression or the Deep Recession. We might need to stimulate demand. So they allowed for that. Okay. And so we go in the post-war period, and maybe we can talk more about the post-war period, but governments get a lot bigger, and governments actively try to influence economic outcome. Okay. And this is in line with their version of what Keynes was all about. And the economies do reasonably well. Okay, it's the golden age for US capitalism by many different measures. The first generation after World War II. We don't have depressions anymore. If you go, everyone knows of the Great Depression, but they don't know we had 6 depressions before that, right? Depressions came every generation. They're normal. We didn't have them anymore. And even our recessions weren't that bad until 1974. And so the argument was, we can sort of forget about Keynes, that the markets do seem to work. And then they said, that Keynesian theory is not consistent with our neoclassical economics. The micro foundations of Keynes are either completely unknown or they're not consistent with ours, because our micro foundations tell us the market works. Okay, and you just need to leave the market alone. And so the argument was, we can't have a macro that tells us the market doesn't work, but a micro that tells us the market does work. So either we have to change the micro or we have to get rid of the macro. And they decided, let's get rid of the macro. Okay, so they throw Keynes away. And that's when Lucas comes along, rational expectation. So they become even more neoclassical than Pagoo had been in the 1920s. Okay, a more ridiculous version where the market always clears continually. Okay, so that becomes the new mainstream. So how did we resolve the difference between the macro and micro? We got rid of the macro. And now what they do is they just have, the perfectly rational individual agent. And then how do we get to the macro? We just add them up. You add up from the individuals. Or the most rigorous ones only have one individual. Believe it or not, all the major central banks in the world are using DSGE, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that have one person in them. Their model of the economy has one person. Their model of the economy has no money. Why would one person use money? Okay, there are no debts. There's no chance of default. There are no banks. This is the model used by central banks to model the capitalist economy. And you wonder why they never get anything right? Because this is their model. So that's how they resolve the disconnect between macro and micro. They just made the macro micro. Okay? It's just an individual maximizing utility through time. Okay? That's dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling. All right. So basically, there is no macro anymore. Now, what about heterodox? Okay, all the heterodox traditions, and those are Marx, Veblen, and Keynes. So Marxists, obviously, institutionalists, and Keynes. It's not Keynesians; they're called post-Keynesians because the Keynesians were the bastard version that I talked about before that tried to keep the neoclassical micro and have shocks to the system. And those are mostly gone now. Anyway, the followers of Keynes are called post-Keynesian. So anyway, all of them share this view that you can't start with micro. You have to start with macro. You start with macroeconomics. How does the economy work? And then when you talk about the micro level, you're talking about people who are living in an economy that operates according to certain macroeconomic principles. And what that means is that they face constraints that come from the macro level. Okay. So let me just give a concrete example to make it obvious what I'm saying. Okay, in a capitalist economy, capitalists are the important decision makers. Okay, contrast to neoclassical economists talk about consumer sovereignty. The consumer makes the decisions, and then the firms react to their decisions. The consumers call the tune. Okay, the firms don't have power. They're perfectly competitive. Okay, and they have to respond to consumers. Okay, the heterodox approach is exactly the opposite. Obviously, the capitalists make the decisions, the important ones. They decide first how many people to employ. It's the most important decision there is. Okay. All right. And why would they employ anyone? Because they want to make money. Capitalists don't want to make goods. They don't want to provide services. They want to make money. Okay. That's the goal of all capitalist production, is to make money. So they hire the number of workers they think they'll need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. Okay, that's the decision-making process. And if you want to know what is Keynes's general theory, that one sentence is the summary. Capitalists hire the number of workers they think they need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. Why are people unemployed? Because no capitalist thinks that he can make a profit by employing them. That's why they're unemployed. It has nothing to do with the wage. Okay. It's that the capitalist doesn't believe they can sell the output at a profit. So people end up unemployed. All right. And what that means is the person who's unemployed is not because they're necessarily lazy. I mean, some of them might be lazy, but that's not the cause. of unemployment in general. The problem is capitalists don't think they can make a profit by hiring them. Okay. And what that means is the solution can't be to lower wages. Because if we lower wages, what's going to happen? Sales are going to go down. Okay, so this is Keynes's explanation of why wages were falling in the Great Depression. They fell by 25%. And unemployment was going up. Well, because if workers don't have wages, they can't buy output. And so the solution can't be to lower wages. So you need macro foundations of micro. So decision making is impacted by what's going on at the macro level. If the economy, we talk about the economy as if it was a person. If the economy is doing well, or if the economy is doing poorly, if the economy is doing well, then there will be more opportunities for capitalists to hire workers. And so unemployment is going to go down. If the economy is doing poorly like it is now, then capitalist expectations are going to be falling, and they're going to be reducing employment, not hiring. So that's the macro foundations of your microeconomics. The micro has to be consistent with the macro. Okay, so the decision making is by the capitalists, not by the consumers. Capitalists are only concerned with one thing, which is ending up with more money than they started with. And then there's lots of other differences between heterodox micro and orthodox micro, because orthodoxy starts with the assumption that capitalists operating in markets are all perfectly competitive. They have no ability to influence price. All right. Now you look at the real world, and obviously this is false. It's extremely hard to find any sector of the economy that even comes close to perfectly competitive or even imperfectly competitive. Okay. The fact is that virtually any market you look at, there will be 2 or 3 dominant firms. Okay. Consistently across the economy. Even if you go down to the service sector, say chimney sweeps in some town in Ohio, there will be 3 firms that dominate, and one of them is going to have costs that are half of the costs of the second best firm. Okay, this is what studies show. So it's always oligopolized or monopolized. They have pricing power. So then the question is, how do they set their price? They don't set it to clear the market. Okay, firms do not, that's the neoclassical view. They don't try to clear the market. Okay, they have a variety of goals. Obviously, they want to cover their costs. Obviously, they want to end up with profit. But my colleague Fred Lee at UMKC was a microeconomist. And he said, firms also are going concerns. They want to stay in business. Okay. And so that will also condition the way that they operate. They don't maximize profits. Neoclassical economists say they try to maximize profits. They don't maximize profits, okay? Because they want to remain a going concern. So they do care about market share and things like that. So you tackle it that way. What would firms do given macroeconomic constraints, but also given market power?
We have a question. I think you've answered parts of this about economic theory and economic policy or politics. Theory is supposed to explain the way the world is, while policy is about trying to make it the way we want it to be. And sometimes it's hard for people to keep these things apart. So our question to you is, could you say something about the relationship between economic theory and policy? That is what the state and state actors do. For instance, how could the choice of theory one holds impact the policy decisions one might take or the outcomes of those policies? And on the other hand, how might one's values or desires about practical outcomes influence the theoretical positions people hold, whether innocently or illegitimately?
Probably most heterodox economists would agree that the reason we study the world, and we're studying an aspect of it, the economic aspect of the world that we live in. The reason we study it is to change it. Okay. So we want to understand how it works so that we can use policy to change it. Okay. Uh, so institutionalists, especially, I come out of the institutionalist tradition, um, see policy making as problem solving. So you identify a problem. Unemployment is a problem. Poverty is a problem. You identify the problem. We need to understand how the economic system works and then try to come up with a policy that can alleviate the problem. And institutionalists, lots of them, focus on the institutions that create the problem. Okay? You identify what Veblen called imbecilic institutions. Okay? Institutions that maybe played a positive role in the distant past. But the economy has evolved to the point where these institutions are now in the way. Okay? Uh, it's pretty easy to think. I mean, the way that women are treated, okay, was an institution, and it becomes a barrier to moving forward. And so we try to resolve those problems. Um, and so problem solving is a process of institutional adjustment. Get rid of the ones that don't work, create new ones to solve the problems. And J. Foster, who was a well-known institutionalist, especially focused on this thing, on problem solving, put forward the proposition that you want minimal dislocation in institutional adjustment. So you get rid of the institutions that are really harmful, but you try to avoid really radical changes in order to um, minimize the disruption to the economy. You want to keep it evolving, but evolution rather than revolution. Now, not all heterodox economists uh, share this view, but that is probably a fairly common view among institutionalists. My professor, Hyman Minsky, started out studying at Chicago, which today is known as the bastion of people like Lucas, the crazy people. It was an institutionalist department when Minsky was there in the just before World War II. He got drafted. He was in Germany, yeah, but he came back, but then he ended up going to Harvard. But anyway, he studied with institutionalists at the time, and he always said policy only works by changing behavior. We need to change behavior in order to change the outcome. Okay? And this is consistent. If you think of what are institutions? Well, they're patterns of behavior. Okay? So he doesn't use exactly the same terminology. And the institutionalists he studied with are somewhat different from the dominant institutional approach today. And another thing that institutionalists argue is that the means and the ends need to be consistent. And this is also, I think, part of the notion of minimal dislocation. So you want a democratic society, the means to getting there need to be democratic. You need to persuade people to come along and make those kinds of institutional adjustments that are necessary. So I think that's the relation. I mean, we could contrast that with the Orthodox, which is that the free market is best. And so if you've got a problem, there must be some kind of intervention. There is something that's preventing the market from working. Probably it's the government interfering. So the government interferes into markets. Now, there could be other problems too, but government interference is the one they mostly focus on. The government is the problem. Maybe none of you are old enough. Ronald Reagan, the government is the problem. We're going to get the government off our backs. And that has been the mantra ever since. Okay. So now we're going on almost 50 years of this, reducing the role of the government in the economy, perfectly consistent with neoclassical economics, because the government is interfering with the market mechanism and the market always knows best. Okay. And Friedman claimed the market is democratic, okay, much more democratic than our politics are. Why? Because it's $1, one vote. That's true democracy. You vote with your dollars, and every vote counts the same. Every dollar has the same weight. Okay? So you get pure democracy if you let the market decide as much as possible. And he was very serious about this. If you read him, he said, we should not be licensing doctors. It's interfering with the market mechanism. It prevents many potentially great surgeons from practicing medicine because they got to get a license first. They work in their garage. They're pretty good with tools, hammers, and chisels. Why can't they do brain surgery? You think I'm joking? He says this, right? He says it's okay to make them register. They got to register their name, locally, and then people can, you know, uh, find out. Okay, that's a practicing doctor, and they can gather information from the market. Well, this guy seems to have killed 50 people so far. I think I won't go to that one. I'll go to a different one. Okay, this is what he says. So anyway, the market is always best. So that's the fallback. In Keynes in 1926, so this is 10 years before the general theory. 10 years before he had figured out what the problem was. Okay, but he wrote a book, The End of Laissez-Faire. So laissez-faire is this notion that the market always works best. He wrote this book, The End of Laissez-Faire, and he said that no one really believes this. And he said, this actually was not an idea that came from economics. It's not our fault. This came from political science. He said, this is just politics. Okay? They don't want a government that can interfere in anything. No one really believes the invisible hand works. Now, he didn't know why it didn't work. He didn't have his theory of effective demand. But he knew that the neoclassical view of the free market was false. Okay. But anyway, what Friedman did after World War II was to try to bring back the market.
Last prepared question, and then we'll go into audience questions about money. One hotly contested question in economics is what money is and how it works. People think all sorts of things about it and have a lot of wild ideas about it, some of which make sense, some are myths. And there are a lot of misconceptions out there specifically about what modern money theory is. So, in order to clear some things up for our members and our viewers, could you just tell us, in your view, what is the most important thing you think the layman needs to understand about money and the kind of money system we live in today? And how would you say, as simply as possible, what money really is and where do people go wrong about trying to understand what it is?
Yep. Okay, so going back to the barter story, um, the focus of the barter story is on a medium of exchange. So Robinson Crusoe and Friday are bartering fish for coconuts, and the problem is that you need what's called a double coincidence of wants. So Friday has fish, but he wants coconuts. Or Crusoe has, let's say, Crusoe has fish, but wants coconuts. Friday has coconuts, but wants fish. Great. We got a double coincidence of wants, they can trade. But what if Friday doesn't want the fish? Then Crusoe can't get the coconuts. Okay. So they say, well, why don't we have a medium of exchange? And I can uh, pay you, and you can hold that, and maybe later you'll decide that you want to buy something. And they hit on using seashells. And then gradually there's this evolution to gold, and then finally to today's paper money, which is completely illegitimate because it doesn't have any real value. And the government is always trying to cause inflation. Um, and so we end up with our money is always going down and all of this story. Okay. Um, it's focusing on medium of exchange. Now, this history is uh, completely false. Money almost certainly came out of record keeping. The history of writing and the history of money are closely intertwined because writing was invented to keep track of debits and credits. Um, so anyway, we need to move away from the idea that money was created to solve this problem in a market. Uh, I could spend a lot of time talking about the props with that story, that for some reason people start specializing to produce for a market before there is any money. It doesn't make any sense at all, and there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence of any economies ever based on barter outside trivial cases like prisoner of war camps, where people already knew how to use money. Um, so the history, the archaeology, the anthropology are all unanimous in rejecting this story. Um, Money, uh, much more likely. You had Michael Hudson on. He's probably the best there is on talking about the origins of money in Mesopotamia, um, where it was for record keeping. And it uh, involves keeping track of credits and debts. That's what money is all about. So rather than thinking of money as something that we can change hands, goes from hand to hand to hand to hand, think of money as nothing more than a scoreboard. So very soon we're going to have the Super Bowl with a scoreboard. It's keeping track of points. But rather than the football scoreboard uh, keeping track, the bankers keep track. The bankers keep track of the credits and debits. Um, Most young people have never used cash. They've never written a check. They've never held money in their hand. Okay. All the money that they've ever used is in this. They actually don't know how to do it. But every payment they've ever made, every payment they ever received was in their iPhone. Okay. They never touched money. So we need to get out of this uh, historical view that money is something you can feel, it's real, you can touch it, it goes hand to hand, it allows you to buy stuff, you use it in markets, to no, it's accounting. It's accounting records, keeping track of your debts and your credits. That's what it's all about. And in capitalism, as I said, the purpose of production is to end up with more money than you started with, and that more money is in the form of digital records. You start with digital records, you purchase the inputs, you hire the labor, you sell for digital records, and you hope at the end you end up with a higher level of digital records. That's what capitalism is all about. That's what money is. Um, so MMT has been emphasizing this, what's called chartalist view of money. When Knapp wrote his State and Money book, in which he explains the chartal view, he does tend to emphasize money as a token, okay? And he uses the cloakroom at a museum as an example. You deposit your cloak and you get a token that's worth one coat, hopefully yours. You submit that token and you get your coat back. While you're holding it, the token is a credit. It's worth a coat. It's a debt of the cloakroom. They owe you a coat. Okay. And you deliver the token and you get your coat back. And that's what coins, tally sticks, paper money were all examples of tokens. They were worth whatever they could be redeemed for. So if the government issued a coin and said, you can use this coin to pay $1 worth of taxes that you owe us, the coin is worth $1. And Innes is the one I like best. A. Mitchell Innes wrote 2 papers that explained the state theory of money and the credit theory of money both. And I think does a better job than Knapp of explaining these things. So I always say they're the 2 best papers ever written on money. He talks about the even a gold coin is only worth, its worth is determined by what it will be accepted for. Okay. Its value is not determined by the gold content. He said that's always been true. A dollar gold coin is worth $1 because that's what it's accepted for, not because it has $1 worth of gold in it. So anyway, the early works, they are typically talking about physical records that you could touch, but today those are pretty irrelevant. Today it's all digital entries, and we keep track. It's like a big game, keeping track of the winners and the losers. The winners get positive credits to their accounts, and the losers get debits to their accounts. So that's what money is, and it's just record keeping. Now, MMT, I think, emphasized a little bit too much. The taxes drive money, and there's some, I think, oversimplification. So some of the criticism of MMT and confusion of what MMT says, I think is our fault. And I'm trying to resolve those problems. You can tell a nice story about how taxes can drive money. So you've got the colonist who goes to Africa. A colonist has a gun and says, you owe me taxes, and if you don't pay them, I have the gun, and I'm going to shoot you. They say, well, how can I pay my tax? Well, you can work hard over here building a road for me. Okay, taxes drive money. You created a demand for money. Okay, fine. And that really happened sometimes. Okay. It's a true story. Or we can talk about the American colonies. So we've used that example a lot. The American colonies could not issue coins. England would not allow it. The colonies had to use the British coin, which means they had to earn it by exporting. Why did Britain want a colony? Because they wanted the exports. So the American colonists had to export to Britain to get the coins that they needed to circulate in America to finance the market, but also finance the colonial governments. Colonial governments couldn't raise enough tax revenue because there weren't enough coins in circulation. So they came up with the idea we can use paper money. So this was the first large scale use of paper money in the West. Chinese have been doing it for a couple hundred years, but first one in the West. And so Farley Grubbs looked at it, and the American colonies, all 13 of them did this. They would pass a law imposing a new tax that was expected to raise, let's say, 100,000 pounds, Virginia pounds, and then they would issue paper money in the amount of 100,000 pounds. They called the tax a redemption tax. So it's very clear they knew exactly what they were doing. They're going to impose a tax payable in this paper money that will create a demand for the paper money. It will be redeemed in taxation, and then they burned all the tax revenue. Okay? This happened. It's true. All right. But that doesn't mean it's so simple. If we look, and I do this in the book I mentioned, the first country to have a modern monetary system was Britain. It took them 400 years. 400 years to do it. It was not easy to just impose a tax and enforce it and get your currency accepted. People didn't want the king's currency because the king was notorious for defaulting on his debts. Okay? You had to build trust. They had to take the power of the purse away from the king and give it to Parliament, which was a little more trustworthy. They had to create the Bank of England, which was a private bank that could finance the king. So you put a bank between, well, Parliament, sorry, finance Parliament and the king. You had to put a private bank in between the government and the people. They trusted the private bank more than the government. So what I'm saying is, it wasn't a simple thing to get to the point where we are today. Just saying, oh, you just impose a tax and that will create a demand for your currency. It was much harder than that historically to build that kind of trust, to get to the point where you could do that. And then the other critique that often is made, people say, I mean, if you talk to average everyday people, when I accept $1, I'm never thinking of the tax I got to pay. You know, I accept $1 because I want to buy an ice cream cone. You know, I'm never thinking of the tax, and of course that's true. Um, the tax is there, but the reason that people want credits in terms of money is because our system is based on the dollar. The whole economy is based on the dollar, and it's a very complex economy. And building that trust in the dollar is also very complex. Why is the biggest economy in the world now is China? Uh, our economy is vastly overrated because of the difference of prices in the countries. Chinese economy is much bigger than ours. And people are talking about the RMB replacing the dollar because you would think, well, biggest economy in the world and a huge exporter, right? Uh, why on earth doesn't the RMB replace the dollar? Well, because it's not that simple. There's a lot of trust in U.S. institutions that stand behind that uh, dollar as an international reserve currency, and China doesn't have those yet. So it's going to be a while.
One question I'd like to ask, a little minor, but I'm very curious about where you would place the Austrian school of thought. Um, I know your book focuses on the uh, mainstream neoclassical. Definitely, the Austrian school is opposed to most heterodox schools, or at least MMT. It treats money as a commodity or a kind of commodity. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Would you consider it fundamentally a variant of neoclassical economics, or is it just a totally separate marginal um, heterodox school of thought in itself?
I don't include it as heterodox. Some of my heterodox friends do because it does have two elements that neoclassical economics does not have, but that heterodox does. One is uncertainty, and the other is time. So they treat time as, you know, there's a past that can't be changed and a future that we don't know. Um, Orthodoxy does not have that. So that makes them different. They're in a different category. However, otherwise, they are pretty consistently neoclassical, free market, super duper free market, uh, anti-government, and yes, they view inflation as a fraud perpetrated, probably purposely, by the government, defrauding people, and that a free market system should be based on a commodity money, probably gold. And so that, that would solve our inflation problem. Okay. Well, I think this is just completely wrong. Uh, when gold standards were fairly rare. Now, I said it took 400 years for Britain to create the modern monetary system. Ironically, they had 400 years of pegged currency. They pegged their currency to gold or silver for 400 years. But that is extremely unique, okay? And extremely rare. Uh, and but it did help to build confidence in the currency. It helps to explain why they were the first to get there and then they went off it. Okay. Now, if you, and many countries went on and off gold in the 19th century. So during the 19th century, countries were going on and off gold and silver. Okay. Then uh, tried to get back on after World War One, helped create the Great Depression. And then we got Bretton Woods, and uh, everyone was pegged to the dollar until Nixon, and then we got rid of that system. Okay. So they like to believe that the 19th century was this utopian period of no inflation. Okay. If you actually look at the price level of 18, so, sorry, 1900 and the end of the 19th century, the price level is the same. Does that mean there were stable prices over the 19th century? The answer is no. The price level uh, fluctuated wildly. It prices declined in all the depressions. Remember, I said we had six. Every depression, prices went down. Every boom time, which usually was a war period or often was a war period, prices went up. And so it just happens at the end points, you have the same price level, but prices were not stable over the century when countries were on gold. Okay. Why is that? Because a uh, a really a peg makes it difficult. I mean, if everyone plays by the rules, it makes it difficult to expand the money supply. Capitalism is a system based on start with money to make more money. You need the money supply to grow. Okay. In order to have more money at the end, it has to be growing. You need the money supply to grow in order to get more sales, in order to accumulate more money profits. So it's not consistent with capitalism. So Austrians, like most neoclassicals, are very pro-capitalist, but their proposition would kill capitalism and does kill capitalism. It's what causes depressions. And what we have decided to do, I don't say that everyone thought, well, let's do this intentionally. We created a system that allows for uh, relatively good growth and no depressions. That's what we did with the New Deal. And then Europe had their own version of New Deal. You have a big government that is always there, that will not let you collapse into a depression. Okay. And because we have no depressions, prices never go down, which means there's only one direction prices can go. The only question is how fast are they going to rise? Okay. They're always going to be going up. They never go down. And the trade-off is we don't have depressions. Now, I think last time I was on, I talked about financial crisis and so on. We still have major problems to solve. Well, we solved one. We haven't had a depression. We had the global financial crisis. It was very bad, but even that was not a Great Depression. We're coming up against another one. We'll see. Do we get a depression this next time because of AI collapsing? Maybe, but we know how to prevent it. And preventing it, I think I talked about last time, it's really ugly what they do to prevent it from happening. But we've decided the trade-off is worth it. Okay, so far. So I don't think there's any way to have this commodity money system. Now, of course, it's crypto. Crypto's the solution. Yeah, right. It's really stable, right? You notice how stable crypto is? It's either one is crazy. Crypto is nothing but a pure fraud. So I think it's far worse than the gold standard. But in terms of stability, obviously it's not stable.
One last question from Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much for speaking with us again. It's really a pleasure and honor. We've been following your work for a long time, and everything you've said is very illuminating and helpful. In the course of your last comments, a question came up, so I actually have two, if that's okay. One is about China, and this is the one that what you said just motivated. We think about this, talk to Michael Hudson about it and so forth, but about the topic of de-dollarization. China, as you said, exports more than it imports. And if that's true, then its currency isn't going to flow out of China into other countries. Other countries' currencies are going to flow into it. And if as long as that remains the case, then its currency couldn't serve as a global reserve currency, right? So if that's right, then when people ask whether China might be the next one to provide the global reserve currency, they just seem to be assuming that it would be another country that gets a free lunch from a financial scam like the USA after August 15th, 1971, when the gold standard ended and it just became pure credit. So, so it'd be the same thing with a different name. It wouldn't really be de-dollarization. It would just be, the dollar with Chinese characteristics or something like that. But it wouldn't be, so when I feel like there's a lot of confusion around de-dollarization because we have to understand the balance of trade. and the directions of the flows and who's accumulating surpluses and so forth. Who's the importer, who's the exporter. So any clarity, first of all, if I've butchered that, please set me straight. But any clarity you could provide on that would be greatly appreciated. And maybe I should just pause. And if it's okay, I'll ask the second one.
That's fine with me. Okay. Um, so yes, the U.S. supplies dollars by importing, and given a choice, countries would rather sell output to get dollars and rather than going into debt to get dollars, because that's the alternative. You don't have to sell anything to America to get dollars. You can borrow dollars. Okay. The UK system, the pound was dominant. UK was an exporter, but the UK financed the world. They lent pounds. All right. So China could do that. They could still be an exporter, uh, but they could become a lender to the world. And they are lending. Uh, and in some parts of the world, developing world. So it's conceivable that it could be done. I think it's preferable that countries have the opportunity to earn the international reserve currency rather than borrowing it and going into debt. The history of developing countries and borrowing um, is not a pretty picture at all. Um, they get over indebted, they have currency crises, and uh, it's not good. My wife is Chinese, and if you go to the Levy website, she and I have a paper, uh, maybe as long ago as 10 years ago, talking about China and the RMB trying to increase international use of the RMB. We have a paper on it. So I think that there's a chance that the RMB will replace the dollar, but it's not going to be for a very long time. The US economy was bigger than the UK economy by the Civil War. Okay. The pound remained the international reserve currency until World War II. And then we took over. That just gives you an idea. It can take a very long time. Just because you're the biggest economy in the world doesn't mean that your currency is going to be the international reserve currency. You have to build trust in your institutions. Now, Trump is doing everything he possibly can to destroy trust in America. So maybe he can make it happen. I don't know. Um, when you sanction other countries and don't allow them access to the international financial system um, for political reasons, you start breaking down the trust. Can you really trust the United States? Do you really want to hold dollars when the US can shut you out and basically steal your dollar reserves? Okay, maybe you don't want to trust the United States. So that could speed up the process of replacements. Many people think that maybe we will have a multipolar world with the U.S. still remaining one of the currencies, but more and more use of other currencies. And then some people fantasize that we could have another Bretton Woods meeting. I think there's zero chance of this because it's not going to be supported by the dominant players, which are China and the US. They will not go for it. What you're talking about, though, that it can be difficult to get the currency, I think that also is a problem for the EU. That's why the euro is not going to be not going to replace the dollar, not going to become a major currency because they're an exporter. It's hard to get euros, and also they try to minimize their government debt. Not real successfully, but You want a country that issues a lot of government debt because that's how you're going to hold the currency. You want to hold government debt. Okay, free lunch. I don't agree that the United States gets a free lunch. Okay. If if you buy a Toyota made in Japan, you're an American, is that a free lunch? No, of course not. You had to either use your income or you had to go into debt to buy the Toyota. Okay. Uh, there's no free lunch for Americans from buying imports. It's exactly the same as if they buy a domestic produced good. It takes their income and or they get indebted. Now, what about the US government? What if the US government buys a Toyota made in Japan? It's a free lunch. But if it's made in Georgia, it's still a free lunch, right? The government just prints up the money and it buys it. The only one who gets a free lunch is the government. Now, there is something, though, there is an advantage, which is that if the rest of the world wants your currency, needs your currency because they're in debt in your currency, then you can run a net export deficit, trade deficit, without any impact on your exchange rate. 99% of the dollars in the world are not demanded for trade. They're financial assets. Okay. And there's a huge demand for dollars around the world. And our little tiny trade deficits have no impact on the exchange rate because that's not what the dollar is held abroad for. People aren't holding the dollar to buy US output. They're holding the dollar as part of a portfolio. And to a lesser extent, you can make the same, and Bill Mitchell makes this argument. The same is true for Australia. Pension funds around the world said, hey, we ought to diversify our portfolio into Australia. Why? Because it's a commodity producer. We want to diversify into commodities. How do you do that? Australian dollars. That's how you diversify. And so suddenly the Australian dollar is in demand, and Australia can run a trade deficit forever without impacting their exchange rate very much. Impacts it a little bit, but not very much. So the key is when financial markets decide to diversify into your currency, then you're getting this so-called free lunch or exorbitant privilege, is what it's called, that there isn't much impact on your exchange rate. You don't need to worry too much about it, which is true. We do have that, which could possibly mean that our central bank will let us enjoy a slightly lower interest rate. Unfortunately, our central bank doesn't think that way. Okay, they keep the interest rate too high. Trump's right about one thing.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's very clear, illuminating, very clear,
Oh, yeah.
very
Sorry.
clarifying. But I mean, and point taken, yeah, ordinary Americans don't get a free lunch from this. I guess my suspicion was more sort of the creditor class gets something out of it. But yeah, the second one was just about discussing so-called MMT, and I found in certain quarters you can't even say that because brains just shut off instantly, not only with right wingers, but especially with a certain kind of leftist. And and the way then after I realized I opened my mouth and I regretted it saying that, I say, well, come on, it's just post-Keynesian economics plus the credit theory of money or the state theory of money. And so one question I wonder, is that an accurate characterization? But then I realize that might not have helped either because I said the word Keynesian and he's the bad one because he's the bourgeois guy who wanted to save capitalism. And so I guess my question is like, can you give any insight? I mean, you've been doing this a long time and I know you have experienced that. And I'm wondering, you know, is there better characterization which might land better? Especially, I'd like to know if that was inaccurate. Because I mean, like as you said, Koletsky, Joan Robinson, Minsky, and in terms of theory, forgetting the politics for a second, they seem pretty much on the same page with Marx on a lot of important questions. But is that a fair characterization? But then why so much hostility from the left? Like I can still remember, I mean, when I discovered your work, um, and the other your colleagues, there was this big kerfuffle in Jacobin about a hit piece Doug Henwick did, and I just thought, why is he saying this? Why? And he's repeating the platitudes about, government deficits. The balance sheet of the government's the same thing as a household, but it's bigger. And I just thought, Pavlina Tcherneva comes out saying, we don't need to tax them for their revenue, for their income, for revenue. If you want to tax them, it's because you don't want them to be that powerful. And I'm just wondering, every round, it's the same thing. If you say MMT, minds turn off on the left, and I just wonder why you think that is.
Yep. Yeah, that everything you said is definitely true. Um, Let me just start with the taxes thing. It's not just heterodox. I would just say progressives who aren't economists. Um, the reason why they hate what we're saying is because they love taxing the rich. Okay. And so if we say, we don't need taxes to provide jobs for all program. We don't need taxes to provide Medicare for all. Okay. Government can pay for it. But I want to tax the rich. We say, yeah, tax the rich. And don't stop with a 3% wealth tax like Elizabeth Warren wanted. Take it all. Okay. 120% tax rate. Send them the bill for the other 20%. Take all of it. We all support that. Okay. The government doesn't need the revenue. They're just going to burn it. I mean, metaphorically, they just wipe it off the balance sheet. It's gone. Okay. It's like the Super Bowl, you know, the scorekeeper puts up a 6 and then the replay shows the guy didn't quite make it. They take it away. Where did it go? It's gone. Okay. Just take it all away. We completely support that. All right. Then what's the problem? This I can tell you. I've been saying this since 1991. I have slides from my lectures to prove it, except for the very last sentence. Okay. So what is the heterodox approach? Okay, first we began with capitalism is a monetary system. It's MCM prime. Start with money to make more money. This is Marx, Veblen, Keynes. They all said exactly the same thing. That's what it is. Okay. Um, Institutionalists add money is all about power. Okay. If you have money, you have power. If you don't have money, you don't have power. So they focus on that aspect of money. The post Keynesians focus on uh, you hold money because the future is uncertain. So this is Keynes, and also endogenous money. Okay, which also was accepted by Keynes, Marx, and Veblen, and MMT. Um, Godley's sectoral balance approach, or Minsky, my professor, when I would come to his office with some crazy idea, he would say, go home, put it in balance sheets. If you can't show me the balance sheets, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay. So sectoral balance approach. And then financial instability hypothesis, that's Minsky. It's accepted by, I think, all of these approaches that there's something about the financial system of the capitalist economy that's fundamentally unstable. Okay. It's destabilizing. MMT accepts all of those. Okay. MMT is in exactly the same paradigm as all of the other approaches. Okay, what did we add? The functional finance approach of Abba Lerner, the state money approach of Knapp, Innes, and also Abba Lerner and Minsky. Um, it's in the same paradigm. Okay, we share the same paradigm. You theories have to be within a paradigm. Okay, the way you view the world, the theory has to work within that. That's Kuhn's uh, scientific revolution. I think all of these things are accepted by heterodoxy. So we're in the same paradigm as them. We accept the same things that they accept. Okay, so whose fault is it? I think to some degree it's our fault, and some degree it's their fault. I think that in the beginning, probably there were two mistakes. One mistake was uh, we were trying to package the ideas in a way that we could communicate to policymakers, politicians, and the general public. Okay, and so we had what Bill calls heuristics. And I mean, Bill mentioned we share the same ones. The taxes drive money is a heuristic. It's a logical statement. The bond sales are a reserve drain. Okay, the idea that government spends by keystrokes. That the government, doesn't need to have revenue in order to spend. All these things, they were simplifications, and it's true that from the beginning, these turned off uh, some heterodox economists from the very beginning. And uh, on the other hand, it spread among the population outside academia. And some heterodox economists have begrudgingly said MMT is the only successful heterodox approach so far. None of the others has been successful. None of the others has been adopted by policymakers. Now, not many have adopted uh, MMT. MMT has made the headlines. Before COVID, always in the negative sense, right? But at least it was recognized. And then in the positive sense, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, it was mentioned. So it's the only one that has made it. So I think that part of our strategy of using simple explanations, heuristics. I remember when Paul Krugman had his column, and he would say stupid things about the government's debt and deficit. And then he would complain because he would get 1,000 comments immediately on his blog explaining to him why he was wrong. These were written by average people. You know, there were probably 1 million people who could have debated Krugman about the deficit and won the debate. Is driving him crazy. You know, there isn't any other heterodox theory that is understood by the general population. And it's a very important one. What we wanted to do was anytime your Congress critter is giving a talk and says something stupid like the government has run out of money, we wanted people in the audience stand up and yell at him. Okay, that was the purpose, and I think we succeeded. So those people are all over the place and all over the world. They're all over the world now who are followers of MMT that are not in academics, maybe never had an economics course. So that was very successful. But the downside was that the heterodox critics never actually read anything that we wrote. What they read was the Krugman summary of what MMT says, or the simplest expositions. They didn't bother to read anything. And I know that because I've read their critiques. And at most, they might have one or two citations. There actually was one uh, critique by a very well-known post-Keynesian. Not one single citation. There were citations, not one single citation to any MMT proponent criticizing MMT. There was the editor of the JEI also used our textbook to criticize MMT. No academic literature whatsoever. She used the textbook written for college students in order to write an academic critique of MMT. Okay, so I think it's also this laziness on their side is a problem. But I'm I'm willing to admit that we made a mistake, and I'm trying to rectify it. To say, yeah, you're right. The tax drive money is too simple. We need to be more careful. And I think you will notice in the revised textbook that we're a bit more careful. We still have to keep it simple, but we're a bit more careful. Then finally, uh, there are, you know, as I said, millions of proponents of MMT, and most of those are not academics. And uh, a lot of people learn about MMT from them, and that is a bit of a problem. That they might oversimplify. And sorry, I forgot to get into the other mistake we made initially was that we didn't really want to talk about the developing world because their situation is different from ours. And the problem was that the the developing world is reading our stuff and they're inviting us to come down and meet with the head of their treasury, the head of their central bank, and we're going down. And we realized, it was a mistake not to write about them and try to include that and maybe have a hierarchy of sovereignty that uh, things are much more difficult in the developing world. And, now we have Fidel uh, and Yen, who were our students, who are very well known, writing about the situation in developing countries. But there still are some statements that are being made. I'm not going to name any names by MMT proponents that are a bit too simplistic to say that always imports are a benefit, exports are a cost. I think that's way too simplistic. Leads to lots of problems.
Well, thank you for being so generous with your time, Professor. Really appreciate it. I enjoyed it. From the looks of it, I think we all enjoyed this.
I have two new books. One is Understanding Modern Money Theory, Money and Credit in Capitalist Economies. It synthesizes my first 1990 book, which was mostly on the private money system, and my 1998 book, which was the beginning of MMT. So it puts those two things together. It's for a more academic audience, let's say. And the second book, it will come out with Princeton, and it's the vision of Hyman Minsky. And I think it would interest some of your listeners because what I try to do is put Minsky in a paradigm in which Marx is one of the main figures of this paradigm. And so it will link up to Marx. Okay, and then finally, Bill Martin and I have been working on the new edition of our textbook. The new one is actually a bit shorter, even though we've added two or three chapters. One on institutional economics. We briefly discussed that in the edition that you have read, but I've written a whole new chapter going in more detail on the institutionalist approach. and then a new chapter on business cycles and economic growth theory. So we have growth, but cycles within the growth. And so that's a new chapter. And then we reduced some other areas and tightened up some of the writing and replaced that chapter near the end that is on contemporary debates because that was 2017. We've moved on, but also we decided rather than presenting the whole debate, we chose some policy issues and we provide an outline of how you might go about researching these, and we're leaving it up to the students or readers to research those areas rather than telling them what to think. And then finally, we also are going to put out a split of the textbook that is aimed for as an introduction to macroeconomics. So it would be for first year students and also for the general audience. So for those people who don't want to get more deeply into economic theory, the new split, which will be much shorter and much simpler than the textbook that you have read. So that will be available sometime in the future. That's it.
Again, thank you so much, Professor, and we hope we can do this again sometime. If you're watching this at home, the course Macroeconomics is held virtually over Zoom and starts March 1st, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can sign up on our website, classunity.org, in the education section. Thank you so much.